Welcome back to the Fear Files. Today, we're exchanging pleasantries with the chilling side of Christmas. Buckle up for 3 bone-chilling, allegedly true stories that will leave you questioning the spirit of the season. Grab your hot cocoa, dim the lights, and prepare for a holiday horror show. Let's get spooky. On a snowy Christmas Eve, photographer John L. embarked on a journey to a remote cabin. But what he encountered on the desolate mountain road would leave him questioning reality forever. A mysterious hitchhiker, an eerie silence, and a gift that defies explanation. Stay tuned to uncover the chilling tale of the silent passenger. John L., a 34-year-old freelance photographer, was no stranger to solitude. He often sought it out, framing lonely vistas and forgotten landscapes through the lens of his camera. But this Christmas was different. This year, solitude had worn him thin. After a grueling 12 months of canceled assignments, a painful breakup, and the gnawing uncertainty of self-employment, he felt the sharp edges of loneliness pressing harder than ever. So when his sister Rachel invited him to spend Christmas at her cabin in Wyoming, he leapt at the opportunity. The cabin, tucked away in a remote stretch of snow-laden forest, promised a much-needed reprieve from his struggles. He packed his Jeep on Christmas Eve, gifts wrapped, an overnight bag tossed in the back, and his beloved camera bag snugly in the passenger seat. The first few hours of his journey were uneventful. Denver's cityscape gradually faded in his rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills blanketed in snow. The quiet hum of the radio filled the car, punctuated by the occasional snap of a distant weather advisory. John felt a flicker of excitement, a longing for the warmth of family, the smell of pine, and the laughter that echoed through Rachel's cabin during the holidays. But as the miles passed, the weather took a sharp turn. What began as a gentle flurry transformed into a blinding snowstorm. The roads, already winding and treacherous, became slick with ice, and the swirling snow swallowed the light of his headlights. The radio signal sputtered out, leaving him alone with the rhythmic thump of the wipers and the muffled roar of the storm. The desolation of the mountain road began to creep into John's thoughts. He hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour, and the dense forest pressed in on either side like an endless white wall. As much as he hated to admit it, he felt the first tendrils of unease curling in his chest. Then, through the haze of the storm, something caught his eye. A figure, a shadow. It stood motionless at the roadside, barely visible in the dim glow of his high beams. John's grip tightened on the wheel as he slowed, squinting through the frosted windshield. It was a young woman. She stood in the freezing cold, her arms wrapped tightly around a small, wrapped gift. Her long, dark hair was flecked with snow, and she wore a light coat that looked woefully inadequate for the biting wind. For a moment, John hesitated. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in weather like this? His conscience quickly overpowered his apprehension. He pulled to a stop and rolled down the window, bracing against the icy gust that blasted into the car. "Do you need a ride?" he called out. The woman nodded silently and approached the passenger door. She moved gracefully, almost as if she were floating over the snow. When she climbed into the car, John noticed 2 things immediately. Her clothes were completely dry, and the air inside the Jeep seemed to grow colder. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. John forced a smile, trying to mask his growing discomfort. "Where are you headed?" "There's a turnoff about 15 miles ahead," she replied, her voice steady but distant. "You can drop me off there." John nodded and began driving again, stealing glances at his passenger. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, with pale skin and a calm expression that unnerved him. She sat perfectly still, the gift balanced on her lap, her hands resting lightly on the wrapping paper. The silence in the car was oppressive. Even the usual sounds of the engine and the tires crunching over snow seemed muffled. John cleared his throat, desperate to break the tension. "Are you heading home for Christmas?" he asked. She nodded but offered no further details. Her gaze remained fixed on the windshield, as though she were watching something far beyond the storm. As they drove, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The heater was on full blast, but the cabin felt icy. He noticed that the woman didn't shiver or rub her hands for warmth. Her presence seemed to suck the life out of the car, leaving only an eerie stillness in its wake. The miles crawled by. Finally, the turnoff came into view, a narrow, snow-covered road that disappeared into the forest. "You can let me off here," she said, her voice firm but polite. John hesitated, glancing at the desolate road. There were no lights, no signs of civilization. "Are you sure?" he asked. "There's nothing out there." She didn't respond, only opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The wind whipped around her as she clutched the gift tightly to her chest and began walking down the turnoff. John sat there for a moment, watching her disappear into the swirling snow. A pang of guilt struck him. He hadn't even wished her a Merry Christmas. He debated for a moment, then made a decision. He turned the Jeep around and headed back toward the turnoff. When he reached it, the road was empty. The snow was untouched, pristine. No footprints, no sign of her. John's stomach tightened. He got out of the car, the wind biting at his face, and shouted into the void. But there was no answer, only the sound of the storm. Shaken, he climbed back into the Jeep and drove away, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. When he finally arrived at Rachel's cabin, he was visibly pale and shaken. Rachel greeted him with a warm hug, but quickly noticed his demeanor. "What happened?" she asked, her brow furrowed. John hesitated, then recounted the strange encounter. As he spoke, Rachel's expression darkened. "There's an old story about that road," she said quietly. "A young woman died in a car accident there years ago. She was heading home on Christmas Eve, trying to deliver a gift to her brother." John felt a chill run down his spine. "What did she look like?" he asked. Rachel described her. Long dark hair, pale skin, and a light coat. John's heart sank. It was her. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. John couldn't shake the image of the woman or the oppressive silence that had filled the car. But the strangest revelation came the next morning. As he unpacked his Jeep, he froze. There, on the back seat, was the small, wrapped gift the woman had been holding. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The paper was smooth, uncreased, and impossibly dry despite the storm. He turned it over in his hands, debating whether to open it, but something stopped him. He placed the gift in a corner of the cabin, where it would remain untouched. Every Christmas Eve since, John thinks about the silent passenger. Was she real? A hallucination? Or something else entirely? He'll never know for sure. But the gift, still unopened, remains a haunting reminder of a story he'll never fully understand. On a cold, desolate Christmas night, a truck driver encounters a mysterious man in a Santa suit standing by an empty road. What begins as an odd meeting spirals into a journey that unearths deeply buried memories and shocking connections. When a simple red box is handed to him, it leads to haunting questions that blur the lines between coincidence and intention. Was this a chance encounter, or something far more profound? I've spent my whole life behind the wheel, logging endless miles as a truck driver. Christmas has always been just another day for me. The world keeps moving, deliveries keep coming, and someone's got to do the job. That year, I was making the long haul back to Idaho after a last-minute shipment. Snow covered the countryside like a thick blanket, and the road stretched endlessly in front of me. It was Christmas night, quiet, eerie, and still. I was on a narrow stretch of highway, cutting through a dense forest when I saw him. A man, standing alone on the side of the road, wearing a Santa suit. He was waving, holding what looked like a small red box in his other hand. The snow was falling heavily now, and his figure was hazy in the swirling white. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. What kind of person would stand out here, dressed like that, in the middle of nowhere. I don't know what compelled me to stop. Maybe it was the absurdity of it. Maybe it was guilt. After all, who am I to ignore someone who might need help, especially on Christmas? Against my better judgment, I pulled over, my tires crunching on the icy road. As I rolled down my window, the man stepped closer, his boots sinking into the thick snow. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a grizzled beard that matched his costume. His Santa hat was askew, and his red coat looked worn, like it had seen better days. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I've been waiting for you." I frowned. "Waiting for me?" He smiled faintly and held out the small box. It was neatly wrapped in red paper, tied with a golden ribbon. "This is for you," he said. "It's important." I stared at the box. My instincts told me to say no, to drive away, but something about the way he looked at me stopped me. There was a seriousness in his eyes, a quiet urgency that I couldn't ignore. "Look, I don't know who you are," I said, "but I think you've got the wrong guy." He shook his head. "No mistake. This is yours." Reluctantly, I took the box. It was lighter than I expected. The man's expression softened, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else. But instead, he stepped back, gave a small nod, and disappeared into the snow. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty road ahead. The man was gone, swallowed by the storm, and I was left holding the strange gift. Part of me wanted to toss it out the window and forget the whole thing, but curiosity got the better of me. I placed the box on the passenger seat and drove off, the truck's heater blasting warm air against my frozen hands. The storm worsened as I made my way home. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and the snowflakes seemed to come at me like tiny daggers. By the time I pulled into my driveway, it was well past midnight. The house was dark, and the Christmas lights my wife had strung up last year still hung lifelessly from the gutters. Since the divorce, I hadn't bothered to take them down. I carried the box inside, setting it on the kitchen counter. The wrapping was pristine, the paper smooth and shiny, as though it had just been wrapped minutes ago. My fingers hesitated over the ribbon. Something about the whole thing felt off, but what could it hurt to open it? Inside was a small, faded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. It was a child's drawing, crude, colorful scribbles that depicted a family of 3, a man, a woman, and a little boy holding hands under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, was a single word: tomorrow. My chest tightened. The drawing looked exactly like one my son, Ethan, had made years ago. He'd been 6 at the time, full of life and energy, always drawing pictures for me and his mom. But Ethan was gone now, killed in a car accident 3 years ago. I'd kept that drawing in my wallet for months after his death, but somewhere along the way, it had been lost. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be the same drawing. But the details were identical. The bright red truck he always insisted on adding, the uneven stick figures, the squiggly sun. Even the misspelled tomorrow was exactly as I remembered. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the drawing still clutched in my hand. Who was that man on the road? How did he have this? And why now? The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. I carried the drawing with me everywhere, unable to let it go. At breakfast, I stared at it, searching for answers that didn't exist. I decided to retrace my steps. Maybe the man, whoever he was, had left some clue about where he came from. I drove back to the spot where I'd seen him, but the road was empty, the snow undisturbed. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Back home, I called my ex-wife, Sarah. We hadn't spoken in months, but I needed to know if she had anything to do with this. "Paul," her voice was cautious. "Is everything okay?" "Did you send me something?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. "A drawing, maybe? Something Ethan made?" There was a long pause. "No," she said finally. "Why would I do that?" "Never mind," I muttered. "It's nothing." "Paul, wait," she said. "Is this about Ethan? What's going on?" I hung up without answering. I couldn't explain it to her. I could barely explain it to myself. The day passed in a haze. I went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every detail of that night on the road. By evening, I convinced myself that it was just a cruel prank, some sick joke meant to mess with my head. But when I glanced at the drawing again, doubt crept back in. As night fell, I sat alone in the living room, the box and its contents spread out on the coffee table. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked the locks on the doors, peered out the windows, but saw nothing unusual. And then I noticed something I hadn't before. On the back of the drawing, faintly scrawled in pencil, was an address. My heart raced as I read it. It was the address of our old house, the one Sarah and I had sold after Ethan's death, the house where we'd been a family. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I had to go to the address. It felt absurd, like chasing a ghost of the past, but I couldn't ignore the pull. Snow crunched under my tires as I parked across the street from the old house. It looked almost the same, except for the new owner's decorations, twinkling Christmas lights and a plastic snowman by the porch. I walked up to the door, my heart pounding. A woman answered, her face wary but polite. "Can I help you?" she asked. I hesitated. "I used to live here," I said. I was wondering if you found anything unusual? Maybe something left behind by the previous owners." Her brow furrowed. "Not that I can think of. Why?" I almost turned away, embarrassed by my own question. But then she said, "Wait, there is something." She disappeared into the house and returned a moment later holding a small, battered toy truck, Ethan's favorite. My breath caught in my throat. "We found this in the attic," she said. "It seemed important, so we kept it." I took the truck from her, my hands trembling. It was impossible, but there it was, as real as the snow under my feet. Driving back home, the truck sat on the passenger seat beside the drawing. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How had these things resurfaced after all this time? Who was the man on the road, and why had he given me this gift? That night, I placed the drawing and the truck on my bedside table. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though Ethan's memory had been brought back to me in some inexplicable way. When I woke the next morning, the drawing was gone. In its place was a single sheet of paper with the words, "You found it. Now let go." And that was it. No explanations, no closure. Just silence and the faint feeling that, somehow, Ethan had given me one last Christmas gift. The box remains on my shelf to this day, a reminder of that strange, snowy night. And every Christmas, I wonder, was it all just coincidence or something more? On a snow-covered Christmas Eve, a couple stumbles upon a mysterious boy standing alone on a quiet street, clutching an intricately detailed snow globe. What begins as a simple act of kindness leads them into an unsettling chain of events that they can't quite explain. As they return to investigate the next day, what they discover about the neighborhood will leave you questioning everything. This chilling holiday story will grip you until the very last moment and linger in your mind long after it ends. I still remember that Christmas Eve vividly. My husband, Michael, and I had spent the evening at my parents' home just outside Toronto. It had been one of those perfect, cozy gatherings, the kind you look back on with warmth. Crackling fireplace, the hum of cheerful conversation, and the smell of roasted turkey lingering in the air. But as we left to head home, the snow began to fall heavily, and the mood subtly shifted. It was already late, past 11, when we started our drive back. We live in the city, so the roads were well maintained, but the snowstorm was relentless. The windshield wipers were working overtime, and the streetlights cast an eerie glow through the thick, swirling flakes. Michael had a tight grip on the steering wheel, and I could tell he was tense, even though he didn't say much. Maybe we should take a detour, I suggested. The main roads might be too slippery. Michael hesitated, but nodded. Yeah, good idea. Maybe we'll avoid some traffic, too. That's how we ended up on the quieter, older streets of a neighborhood I didn't recognize. It was one of those areas that felt frozen in time, with charming houses decked out in Christmas lights. The snow seemed to muffle everything, leaving only the crunch of our tires and the occasional gust of wind. For a while, we drove in silence, both of us marveling at how picturesque everything looked. It's beautiful here, I said, gazing out the window. How have we never been through this area before? Michael shrugged. Maybe it's new, or maybe we just never noticed it. We turned onto a particularly narrow street, the kind where the branches of towering maple trees met overhead to form a natural archway, now weighed down by the season's first heavy snow. The street was blanketed in a crisp, untouched layer of white, save for the twin tire tracks of earlier travelers. Each house on the block seemed to compete with its neighbor in a dazzling display of holiday spirit. Multicolored lights wrapped tightly around the trees sparkled like gemstones, while glowing nativity scenes sat nestled in yards, their halos illuminating the snow like something out of a Christmas card. Reindeer made of twinkling lights stood frozen mid-prance, their shadows dancing faintly as the wind stirred the occasional strand of lights. It was the kind of enchanting scene that felt both cozy and surreal, as though we had stepped into a storybook. As we crept further down the street, the magic of the decorations took on an almost eerie quality. The golden lights reflected off the snowbanks, creating an otherworldly glow that blurred the line between fantasy and reality. My breath fogged up the car window as I leaned closer to take in every detail, marveling at the precision and care that went into each display. Yet, something didn't sit quite right. The deeper we ventured, the quieter it seemed. The usual muffled hum of distant cars or the chatter of bundled-up neighbors was absent, leaving only the crunch of our tires on the icy road. It was beautiful, yes, but in that stillness, there was an undercurrent of unease, like the moment before a snowstorm when the air feels electric. "Stop the car," I said abruptly. "What? Why?" Michael asked, startled. "Just stop," I insisted. He pulled over, and I pointed toward a small figure standing on the sidewalk. It was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and a knitted hat. He was holding a snow globe in his hands and staring intently at it. The sight was so unusual that it made me uneasy. "What's he doing out here by himself?" I murmured. Michael frowned. "I don't know. Maybe he's waiting for someone." "In this weather?" I shook my head. "We should check on him." Reluctantly, Michael turned off the engine. We both got out, the cold biting instantly through our coats. The snow was falling heavier now, and the boy hadn't moved an inch. As we approached, I called out softly, "Hey there, are you okay?" The boy lifted his head slowly and looked at us. His expression was hard to read. Not scared, not sad, just calm. He didn't say anything, just held the snow globe up slightly, as if offering it to us. "Where are your parents?" Michael asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Do you live around here?" Again, no response. The snow globe glimmered in the light from the nearest house. It was intricately detailed, with tiny figures skating on a frozen pond surrounded by miniature evergreens. It was beautiful, but there was something about the way the boy was holding it that unsettled me. "Let's take him to that house," I suggested, gesturing to the one he was standing in front of. It was a lovely 2-story home with a wreath on the door and candles flickering in the windows. The boy didn't protest as we guided him up the driveway. I knocked on the door, feeling a strange sense of unease that I couldn't shake. After a few moments, the door opened, and an elderly woman appeared. She was dressed in a cardigan and had a look of mild confusion on her face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes darting between us and the boy. "We found this boy outside," I explained. "We thought he might belong to someone in your house." The woman frowned deeply, then shook her head. No, I don't know him. Are you sure he's from around here? Michael and I exchanged a glance. We just assumed, I said. He won't tell us anything. The woman stepped outside and crouched slightly to look the boy in the eye. Where are your parents, dear? She asked softly. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he held out the snow globe to her, just as he had with us. The woman's face softened for a moment, but then she straightened and shook her head again. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what to do. Maybe you should call the police. Yeah, Michael said quickly. That's probably the best idea. The woman nodded, stepping back inside. She closed the door gently but firmly, leaving us alone with the boy once more. I pulled out my phone, but when I glanced back at the boy, he was holding the snow globe out to me again. His calm demeanor was starting to unnerve me. Against my better judgment, I took the snow globe from his hands. It was heavier than I expected, and as I looked closely, I noticed something odd. The house inside the globe looked almost exactly like the one we were standing in front of. Emma, Michael said sharply, pulling me from my thoughts. He's walking away. I looked up just in time to see the boy heading down the street, his small figure disappearing into the thick curtain of snow. Wait, I called out, but he didn't stop. Michael started to follow him, but I grabbed his arm. Don't, I said. Let's just go home. He hesitated, but eventually nodded. Without another word, we got back in the car. I kept the snow globe in my lap the whole drive home, unable to shake the feeling that something about that encounter wasn't quite right. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. Let's go back to that street, I said to Michael over breakfast. I want to see if we can find that boy's family. Michael sighed but agreed. We drove back to the neighborhood, retracing our steps from the night before. But when we turned onto the narrow street with the maple trees, my stomach dropped. The houses were there, but they weren't the same. The festive decorations were gone, replaced by peeling paint and boarded-up windows. The house where we had spoken to the elderly woman looked abandoned, its yard overgrown and covered in snow. This can't be the right street, Michael said, though his voice was uncertain. I clutched the snow globe tightly, my heart racing. To this day, I don't know what to make of that night. The snow globe sits on our mantel, a strange and beautiful reminder of a Christmas Eve that still leaves me with more questions than answers.